Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us. This time around, we'll be focusing on the issues of cost of governance. A lot of people have said one of the major problems in this country is the amount of money spent in running government is just too high. And today, the federal government had come forward to say that there is an immediate implementation for additional cost-saving measures aimed at instilling financial discipline and prudence, particularly in the area of official travels. And so the federal government came forward to say all ministry, department, and agencies are required to submit their yearly travel plans for statutory meetings and engagement to the office of the SGF. On the travels of the executive, some of members of the cabinet, the president said, except with the express approval of president, ministers, permanent secretaries, chairman of extra ministerial department, chief executive officers, and directors are restricted to not more than 2 foreign travels in a quarter. And the kind of travel that they can engage in and also be stipulated. There's some of the officials that can make a business class travel. And also, the Ministry of Labor had also muted the idea that there will be cuts in the cost of governance and the review of the allowances of public office holders, including governors and lawmakers. It was recent that Senator Rochas Okorocha said there is no need to have 3 senators per state. And he said also that there shouldn't be more than 3 House of Reps members per state. Let's get a sense of what this means altogether for the nation's economy. And we get a benefit of the experience of a former minister. We are joining us from our studio in Abuja, Mr. Osita Chidoka, a former Minister of Aviation. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. What do you make of this decision of the Buhari-led government? Some will call it an austerity measure. Do you think that is a good step in us cutting the cost of running government?
Thank you very much, Seun. Before I answer your question, I just want to say publicly that my heart goes out to the traders in Onitsha and all the people in Onitsha market who are currently engulfed with fire and no help has been able to come to them. So I feel very, very sad about the incident. Onitsha market fire has been a recurring decimal in our life in Anambra State, and I hope the government and the people of Anambra State will take fundamental decisions to resolve the issue of fire and the ability to contain these fires when it happens in Onitsha. My heart goes out to all the families who have lost their lives in this. And back to the topic we have today, I want to say that the issue of cost of governance, restricting international trips for me, seems to be a government that have refused to act with data and with evidence. Now, if you look at the 2019 budget, it budgeted about 4.7 trillion for recurrent expenditure. Of this amount, 52% was for wages. 52% of this amount went for wages and salaries of government-owned agencies, MDAs, and the civil service. Only 9% of that money was for overheads. And inside the overheads, if you narrow it down, the cost of T&T, travels and tours, will probably be less than 20% of the 9% of the total budget. So the ministers, restricting them to 2 trips a quarter for me and ministers and chief executives is begging the issue. President Obasanjo started it with ministers flying first class. All ministers had to get approval from the president before they could leave the country. So as a minister, I never could stand up and just travel. I needed to get the president's approval, writing through the secretary to government's office. So that has always been there. That is not the issue about the cost of governance. The cost of governance has more serious issues. That 52% of our non-debt recurrent expenditure goes to salaries and wages. Now, salaries and wages are not bad. What is at issue is that if you look at many of the government agencies, the Steve Orosaya Committee, which unfortunately the President Jonathan's committee government could not implement fully his decisions, had listed out government agencies that have overlapping functions, government agencies whose functions need to be aligned, and a way of making sure that certain cadre of government staff, including what we call the executive cadre, that we retrain them and allow them to go back into business. So there are difficult fundamental decisions to be done to bring down the cost of governance. The cost of governance has been ballooning. It didn't start with this government, but this government now, faced with the headwinds of poor revenue, rising debt, the nation is in a very, very divided state. It offers the nation an opportunity to take a serious look at the fundamental issues of cost of governance. Of course, I had proposed in public that we need to have a unicameral legislation. I don't think there's any reason for us to have a bicameral legislature at this point in time. Secondly, I don't think there's any need for us to have two-term governance in Nigeria. I want every governor and the president to come out and tell us how much they raise from the public sources for their campaign. Most of the campaign for second-term elections end up being funded by government and government agencies and business and contractors. So I think that Nigeria can do well with a single-term presidency and executive offices, with a unicameral legislature. We need to go back like the Kenyans did and press the reset button. There is no need for us to keep pretending that we can sustain this. It is not sustainable. Looking at how the world is going, looking at the end of what I call the fuel economy, that is going to come to an end sooner than later. So I think that what the president has announced is just, for me, cosmetic. It is just playing to the gallery, because before now, ministers never used to travel without the president's approval, or chief executives of parastatals. So I think that we need to go beyond that. That's very serious. We need to look at that 52%. We need to look at that wage structure and see whether we can do something fundamental to bring down the size of government, which will in turn lead to reduction. If the government had told us how many trips per year a minister does in Nigeria, minus the Minister of Foreign Affairs and if you have foreign commitments, then maybe we could be saying that they are going to be saving X amount of money by reducing the number of trips. But what they've simply done is to just reduce it to 2. Why 2? It could have well been 1. Why should they travel twice a quarter? It could have well been 3. So we need to know, what is the government saving? What is the cost structure of the recurrent expenditure, the travels and tours? Again, they need to look about the local travel and tours, because ministers who go to their home villages every weekend, and the government pays for that on their private visit, because all the people, the protocol officer, the drivers traveling with them are on official duty. So government needs to look at the local travels and see whether that the government budget on travels, that the executive officers, chief executives and ministers are not overusing it, because local trips also are a major cost center. And finally, I think the government needs to go beyond that and start thinking about other cost-saving measures in the travel budget. Why can't we have a single ticketing office for government agencies, a single travel office, to make sure that people are not buying expensive tickets when they're traveling, to make sure that people are using the right class of travel, to make sure that we are also patronizing Nigerian airlines or African airlines who go to that route. It is important that we look beyond just what I call cosmetic efforts, like announcing ban on ministers traveling twice a quarter. What if all the travels the minister has to do in a year is about 4 trips in 1 quarter? How do you restrict him to that? All his engagements are in 1 quarter. So it is not an intelligent move.
Yeah. So let us look at it, because a lot of people who are in the know will understand that if you need to change some of these costs of running government, the ballooning nature of the size of government, because the size of it is another issue. The size brings about the amount of money to service it and to pay people's salaries and wages. The issue now is the fact that you need to then go to the Constitution to fix the Constitution to cut down the size. But you have been in cabinet. What can you tell Nigerians? Because they said there's devil in the details. Which other areas do you think are also of an urgent need for this government to look into to cut cost of governance, especially because of your experience when you were a minister?
Yeah, looking at the cost of governance, like I said, is the 2 critical things is that the major cost for the government in Nigeria today is that 52% of its recurrent expenditure goes to salaries and wages and pensions. So that's a major cost item. meaning that if you reduce the amount of people or agencies in government, you will reduce that cost component. Now, there's a problem when people talk about the recurrent expenditure. The challenge I see is that when you talk about the overheads, if you go and recruit 100,000 policemen and you do not provide them in that budget money for their uniforms, money for their radio message, money for their pens, for fueling for their vehicles, then the 100,000 people you're paying them for nothing. So one of the challenges we have in Nigeria today is that we have a huge bureaucracy and very little money for that bureaucracy to perform its functions. So you go to a police station, you have to buy your own paper, you have to buy your own pen to be able to write a statement. You go to the fire service, like it's happening in Onitsha today, they don't have water. Government has employed people, they're paying them salaries, but there's no tanks and water to help curb fire. All agencies of government suffer from that same fundamental problem. So when you look at the cost of governance, I think that the major issue is that once we identify our goals and aims as a government, what we want to deliver to the people, then we have to think about, do we have the right manpower to deliver it? And do we have the right resources for them to deliver it? All this can happen in a reduced form if we reduce the expansion that has happened in government over the past maybe 30 years now. It goes starting from the military era. We've been creating agencies, the Federal Character Commission, the Fiscal and Revenue Mobilization Commission, the Debt Management Office. Many agencies have come out of this, but some of them useful. But we need to look, are there agencies that are existing before whose functions can then be turned to this new function, who can now be changed instead of starting fresh agencies? The National Assembly should also have a moratorium on creating new agencies.
All right, Mr. Chidoka, let me put you right on the spot. And we're looking at solutions on how to do this. But perhaps before I put it on that spot, it's going to be another question of the fact that some people, when they heard what the Buhari government has done today, they said kudos because it's a way to start. But you do not think that it's a brilliant way to start. If you are to advise or, perhaps think in another direction, which better way do you think the Buhari government should have started in cutting down costs, knowing full well that Constitution needs to be consulted before you can change most of the things?
The first major way to start is to evaluate the cost. Let us know where the money is going to. Where is the money going to? Because we need to have a system that shows clearly where the money is going to before you begin to think about where to cut the cost from. You cannot take a back-of-the-envelope approach to cutting costs. Where is the money going to? 9% of government budget, of the recurrent budget, went to overheads. Where in overheads are we getting leakages from? Government agencies are not paying for their electricity bills these days because government does no more control NEPA. Government agencies do not pay NITEL anymore because they have to pay here and now for telephone calls and co. Government agencies, we need to know where is the cost going to. So government needs to come out to Nigerians and say to them, this is our cost problem. We are spending a lot of money in travels. Therefore, we are cutting down on travels. I think that what they are doing is to just get what I call public accolade. And that public accolade will not lead to any significant reduction in cost. President Obasanjo had done this during his time. President Yar'Adua had done this during his time. Ministers has been restrained from travels and all that. But that's not where the issue is in the ministries. There are more serious issues of where the government resources are going to. Let us have an open conversation. This is why I've been advocating that the country is in a state where this government is greatly enabled, greatly opportuned, is in a historic moment to be able to tell Nigerians our cost structure is unsustainable. Let us have a debate about it. What we look forward to our president is for him to communicate his hopes and dreams about Nigeria. We don't want to hear about palliative measures like cutting down 4 trips. So 2 trips times 4 quarters means that the minister can travel 8 times. As Corps Marshal, I never traveled 8 times out of the country in a year. Where will I get the time for that? No minister has time to go to the country 8 times out of in a year.
Chidoka,
so the 8 times doesn't make sense for any minister that is not a foreign minister.
It's now time for me to put you right on the spot. And the question I'm going to ask you is that, assuming you are the president today, and you have to take a drastic decision because of the issues of the deficit in our budget, the debt burden in the nation, and the low revenue or the dwindling revenue, what would you do if you were to take a drastic decision should you be president today?
I'll bring out the Orosanya report and look at it again. I will bring out the Constitutional Amendment, the Constitutional Reforms Committee report, and I will set up a committee to present to Nigerians. This is our cost structure today. We want to have our cost within the next 3 years. We want to have the cost of governance. Our goal is a 50% or 40% reduction, and this is where the reduction is going to come from. And in doing that, we must also contain that the budget, the government already has money for social investment. So those who will lose jobs in the course of this rationalization and merging of agencies, we will have a plan to also empower them by providing them financing to go into businesses or retooling them to go into other forms of activity like agriculture or in the ICT world today. But the most important thing to do is to go back and bring out the work that has been done by previous governments on cost reduction. The Orosanya Committee panel report is a place to start with. If I were the president, that is the report I will start with today.
There's one area, since you were in the Ministry of Aviation and you administered that sector, it's a good way to ask you, I mean, it's a good position to ask you, what do you think about my next question? And that is the fact that the APC government or the party, one of the campaigns they had was that they were going to cut down on the presidential flight or the fleet in the presidential fleet. They're going to cut down the number of the birds, the number of the planes in the presidential fleet. And that we do not think happened. Give us a sense of how much it costs to run, because we understand that there will be servicing running into several millions of naira to service the presidential fleet and all of that. Is it something that we can bear as a nation to run the kind of fleet that the nation possesses at the moment?
Again, in the Ministry of Aviation, we have no oversight over the presidential air fleet. So the presidential air fleet is run mainly by the Nigerian Air Force. So, so I don't have visibility on its cost structure and how much they spend on the activities. But I know that it's going to be high because of the nature of aircraft and facilities they have there. But it is important again to say, if the government have taken a decision that our cost structure has to reduce by a certain percentage over a certain period of time, then part of the places to look at is the presidential fleet and look at the cost of running the presidency itself. The presidency has grown over time, including from the air fleet to other parts of the presidency. So it will be a good place to start by saying that the presidential air fleet has to maintain a certain cost ratio to be able to sustain about a 40 or 50% reduction in cost. Saying that ministers will, like I said before, saying just that ministers will fly business class, that has always been the rule. Since President Obasanjo, ministers are to fly business class. So what I think is important in bringing down cost is for the president to set a target. I want to reduce cost by this number over this period of time. And then we can look across all agencies, across all cost centers of the government, and begin to see how each one will contribute to that cost reduction. And that, for me, will be an intelligent and evidence-led way of reducing cost. This knee-jerk reaction of announcing, ministers are restricted to traveling bi-quarterly, for me, does not make sense and will not resolve the problem, both in the short term and in the long term.
Mr. Osita Chidoka, a former Minister of Aviation, he also headed the Federal Road Safety Corps at some point in the life of the nation. Thank you so much for the benefit of your experience that you have shared tonight on the program. Thank you so much for talking to us on the program. So we'll take a break. And when we come back, we hear also from a member of the APC who was being in the national, was being a lawmaker and a lawyer, on what the strategy of the APC government is and if it is the way to go. Join us again, everyone.